When the millionaire first encountered the new housekeeper, he was stunned upon seeing her necklace, the very same one his daughter had worn when she disappeared years ago. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. It was a quiet day, as quiet as one could expect in a house so large, but something about this silence felt unsettling to Henry Caldwell. As he walked through the grand hallway, his footsteps echoed with each step, the sound a stark contrast to the usual commotion that filled his life. His new housekeeper, Marie, had started that morning. She had come highly recommended, quiet, efficient, and respectful of boundaries, exactly what he needed in his sprawling, empty house. He barely glanced at her when he entered earlier that day, distracted by phone calls and business. But now, as he returned earlier than expected, something stopped him in his tracks. She was standing by the window, adjusting the curtains, her back to him. But it wasn't her presence that caught his attention, it was the necklace around her neck. A simple, elegant silver chain with a small pendant. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto it, the world around him narrowing to that single object. That necklace. It was unmistakable. He had seen it countless times on his sister, Sarah, before she vanished all those years ago. He could never forget it. A family heirloom passed down for generations, its intricate design impossible to replicate. How could this woman, a complete stranger, be wearing the very thing his sister had worn the day she disappeared? His voice was barely a whisper, thick with shock. "Where did you get that necklace?" Marie turned slowly, her face calm and composed, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. She touched the pendant absent-mindedly, then looked up, her eyes meeting his. "My necklace?" she asked, her tone puzzled. "It was a gift." "Why do you ask?" Henry's mind raced. His world tilted as memories he had buried long ago flooded back, the last time he had seen his sister, the police investigations, the unanswered questions, and the constant void that her disappearance had left in his life. "Who gave it to you?" His voice trembled with intensity now, his eyes not leaving the necklace. Marie hesitated for a second, a subtle frown forming on her face. "It was from someone, a friend," she said, her voice quieter, as if unsure of what to say next. "A friend?" Henry took a step forward, his composure slipping. "That necklace belonged to my sister, Sarah. She disappeared years ago." How could you possibly have it?" The weight of his words seemed to hit her, and for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed her face. She reached up to the pendant again, her fingers tightening around it as if it might hold the answers to the growing mystery. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, though her eyes told a different story, one of confusion, fear, or perhaps a secret yet to be revealed. And in that moment, Henry knew his life was about to change once more. Just as it had when his sister had disappeared, leaving him with nothing but pain and questions. Now, years later, this woman had appeared, unknowingly holding the key to the greatest mystery of his life. The silence between them grew heavy. The air in the room thickened with tension as Henry's eyes bore into the necklace, and Marie's hand dropped it nervously. There was something there, something she wasn't saying, and Henry could feel it in the pit of his stomach. His instincts, honed by years of business negotiations, told him she knew more than she was letting on. "I need to know where you got that necklace," he said, his voice steadier now but no less forceful. "This isn't just a coincidence." Marie stepped back slightly, her gaze shifting to the floor. I don't know how to explain this. It's complicated." Henry clenched his jaw, trying to suppress the wave of frustration rising inside him. "Complicated? My sister has been missing for over 10 years, and that necklace, it was hers. I won't let this go, Marie. Please, just tell me the truth." She hesitated again, clearly battling with something inside her. Henry's heart raced as the silence stretched. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know it was yours. I didn't know it belonged to someone important." Her eyes flickered up to meet his, and for a brief second, he saw a flash of guilt, or maybe fear. "I was given this necklace by a man. A few years ago." He said it was special. Henry's mind whirred. A man? A cold chill ran down his spine. Could this man have been involved in Sarah's disappearance? Had he been close enough to her to take something so personal? The possibilities flooded his thoughts, each more unsettling than the last. Who was this man? Henry asked, trying to control his breath. His voice had dropped lower, becoming almost dangerous in its intensity. Marie shook her head slightly, as if trying to distance herself from the situation. I don't know much about him. We worked together briefly. He was quiet, kept to himself. But he gave me this before he left, saying it was a token of friendship. I didn't question it at the time. I had no idea. Her words trailed off, and Henry felt a mix of disbelief and fury rising in him. Someone had handed over his sister's necklace like a casual gift. Whoever this man was, he had to be found. But there was more to it than just the necklace, there had to be. Henry's thoughts drifted back to Sarah. She had been everything to him growing up. As her older brother, he had always been protective of her, and her disappearance had shattered him in ways he couldn't fully express. For years, he had blamed himself for not being there, for not stopping whatever had happened to her. He had searched relentlessly, hiring private investigators, combing through police reports, and even offering rewards for information, but nothing had ever come to light. Until now. I need his name, Henry said, his voice softer now but no less insistent. This man, he could be the key to finding out what happened to my sister. Marie swallowed hard. His name was David. David Arnett. The name hit Henry like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a name he had heard before, but it carried a weight, one that seemed to darken the room. He didn't know this man, but he was about to find out everything he could about him. I don't understand, Henry said, his voice dropping as the enormity of the situation sank in. How could this man have gotten hold of that necklace? Was he involved with my sister in some way? Marie's eyes flickered with uncertainty. I don't know. He was always so distant. But now that you've told me this, I feel like I should have questioned it more. I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell, I didn't know. The apology felt hollow, but Henry knew it wasn't entirely her fault. Whoever this David Arnett was, he had been living in the shadows of his life, carrying a piece of Sarah with him. And now, through some strange twist of fate, it had found its way back to Henry. I'm going to find him, Henry said, more to himself than to her. His eyes hardened with determination. And I'm going to find out what happened to Sarah. Marie watched him with wide eyes, as if realizing the gravity of what had just been set in motion. What are you going to do? I'll do whatever it takes, Henry replied, his voice cold. I'm not letting this go. Not this time. And with that, the weight of the past that had haunted him for over a decade crashed down upon him once more. But this time, he had a lead, a fragile, delicate thread of hope. And he would follow it, no matter where it led. As he turned to leave the room, Henry's mind was already racing with possibilities. Who was David Arnett? How did he come to possess something so precious to his sister? And more importantly, what had happened to Sarah? But one thing was clear, this was far from over. And for the first time in years, Henry felt the stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, hope. The cold night air wrapped around Henry as he stepped out of his mansion, his thoughts racing ahead of him. David Arnett. It was a name that now carried weight, a key to unlocking the mystery that had consumed him for over a decade. He had been so close to giving up, resigning himself to the idea that Sarah was gone forever, her disappearance an unsolved tragedy. But this unexpected lead, this housekeeper with his sister's necklace, had ignited a fire in him once more. The next morning, Henry didn't waste time. He called a private investigator, an old contact from the years he had spent searching for Sarah. Paul Gaines was meticulous, persistent, and discreet. If anyone could track down David Arnett, it would be him. When Paul arrived at the mansion, his eyes showed the usual curiosity, but he didn't ask questions. He had known Henry long enough to understand that this case was deeply personal. I need you to find someone, Henry said as they sat in the study, the heavy scent of leather and wood filling the air. David Arnett. That's all I know. He's connected to Sarah. Paul raised an eyebrow, taking in the weight of Henry's words. He had worked on Sarah's case before and knew how much it had cost his old friend. I'll get on it right away. I'll start by digging into public records, and I'll reach out to a few contacts who might have seen or heard of him. If he's been under the radar, we'll find out where he's hiding. Henry nodded, though the weight of uncertainty pressed down on him. As Paul left, he felt that familiar tug of hope, but it was tempered by years of disappointment. He couldn't afford to get too attached to the idea of finding Sarah, at least, not yet. A few days later, Henry's phone rang. It was Paul. His tone was unusually serious, cutting straight to the point. I found him. David Arnett. But, Henry, you need to sit down for this. Henry's heart raced. What did you find? Paul hesitated. He's been dead for 2 years. The words hit Henry like a freight train. Dead? How could that be? His mind reeled. Dead? How did he die? According to the reports, it was a car accident. No foul play involved, just a freak accident late at night. But here's where it gets complicated. I spoke to a few people who knew him, and it turns out David wasn't exactly the model citizen. He had a lot of secrets, one of which may be connected to your sister. Henry's grip on the phone tightened. What do you mean? I found a woman who used to work with him at one of his old jobs. She mentioned that David had a habit of disappearing for long stretches, no explanations. He kept his personal life completely hidden, and no one really knew where he went or who he was with during those times. But she remembered one thing that stood out. About a year before he died, he started carrying around a silver necklace. He never talked about it, just wore it occasionally. The necklace. It had to be the same one. Henry felt his throat tighten. What else did she say? Paul exhaled, as if weighing the information carefully. The woman said that David had been involved with a small group of people, something off the radar, nothing criminal, but secretive. They met occasionally, but she couldn't get details. Whatever it was, he kept it hidden. I'm digging deeper, but so far, I haven't found anyone else who knows more about that group. Henry's mind churned. If David Arnett was dead, the trail seemed to have gone cold again. But the necklace, and this mysterious group, hinted that there was more to the story. Why had David possessed the necklace? Had he known Sarah? Or worse, had he been involved in her disappearance? Keep digging, Henry said, his voice steely. There has to be something else. Someone in that group, or someone connected to him, knows what happened to Sarah. Paul agreed, but Henry could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they still didn't form a clear picture. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. The revelation that David Arnett was dead had sent him spiraling into memories of Sarah, the last time he had seen her, the hope in her eyes, and the way she had simply vanished. The guilt weighed on him, heavier than ever. He had been so focused on his business, his life, that he hadn't noticed the cracks forming around her. Sitting in his darkened study, Henry's gaze fell on a family photo. It had been taken years before Sarah disappeared, back when everything had felt simpler. He traced his fingers over her image, her bright smile, her kind eyes. She had been so full of life. How could it all have slipped away? The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. It was Marie. She stood at the doorway, looking uncertain, as if she knew the weight of what had been revealed. I didn't mean to disturb you, she said softly. Henry shook his head. It's fine. I haven't slept much anyway. Marie hesitated before stepping inside. I've been thinking about what you said, about your sister. I feel like there's more to this. That man, David, he was always so closed off, but there was something about him, something that felt wrong. Henry looked at her, searching her expression. Do you think he was involved in her disappearance? Marie bit her lip, struggling to find the right words. I don't know. But there were things he said, little comments that didn't make sense at the time. Now that I know about your sister, I wonder if he was trying to hint at something without saying it outright. Henry's pulse quickened. Like what? Marie paused, her eyes darkening as if reliving old memories. He once said something about people being lost but not gone. I thought he was just being cryptic, but now I wonder if he was talking about your sister. Maybe she's not gone, Henry. Maybe she's still out there, but hidden. The words hit him like a jolt of electricity. Could it be? Could Sarah still be alive, out there somewhere, waiting to be found? For the first time in years, Henry felt a spark of real hope. Marie's words hung in the air, filling the room with a tension Henry hadn't felt in years. Lost but not gone. It echoed in his mind, over and over, each repetition bringing a new wave of possibility. Could Sarah still be alive, out there somewhere, hidden in the shadows? The thought was almost too much to bear, but the hope it sparked was undeniable. He stood up, running a hand through his hair. What else do you remember about David? Anything that could give us more of a lead? Marie seemed to think for a moment, her brow furrowed. There wasn't much. He never talked about his past or his personal life, but there were moments, little things that stuck with me. Once, when he thought no one was looking, I saw him holding that necklace. He wasn't just wearing it, he was staring at it, almost like it haunted him. Henry's heart raced. That necklace had clearly been important to David, just as it was to Sarah. But why? What connection could he have had to his sister? Did he ever mention anyone else? Friends, family? Maybe someone in this group he was involved with? Marie shook her head. He didn't talk about them openly, but I do remember overhearing him on the phone once. He was arguing with someone who seemed to know a lot about him. I caught a name. Lena. I don't know who she was, but the way he spoke about her, it felt like she was important. Maybe she knows more. Lena, Henry murmured, filing the name away. He wasn't sure how it fit yet, but it was another piece of the puzzle, another thread to pull. He turned back to Marie, his voice calmer but no less urgent. If you think of anything else, anything at all, I need to know. This might be our only chance to find out what really happened. Marie nodded, her eyes sincere. I will. I want to help. Over the next few days, Paul Gaines worked tirelessly to track down leads on Lena. It wasn't easy, there were no clear connections between David and anyone by that name. But after what felt like an eternity, Paul called with a breakthrough. I found her, Paul said, his voice tense with both relief and concern. Lena Arnett. She was David's sister. She lives in a small town about 2 hours from here. Henry's heart skipped a beat. David had a sister. This was the first real link he had to Sarah's disappearance, and if Lena knew anything, she could be the key to finding his sister, or at least understanding what had happened to her. I'm going to see her, Henry said, already reaching for his car keys. I'll meet you there, Paul replied. This could be tricky. We don't know what kind of person she is or how much she knows. It's best if we handle this carefully. The drive to Lena's town felt endless. The countryside blurred past Henry's car windows as his mind raced with questions. Who was Lena? Did she know what David had done, or worse, had she been involved? Was Sarah still alive? Every possibility, every scenario played out in his mind, the hope growing stronger and more fragile with each passing mile. When Henry finally arrived at Lena's house, Paul was already there, standing by his car, his expression serious. The house was small and unassuming, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood that seemed far removed from the mysteries that had haunted Henry's life. She's expecting us, Paul said as Henry approached. I called ahead. She was hesitant, but she agreed to meet. Henry nodded, his nerves on edge. Together, they walked up the path to the front door. Paul knocked, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. Lena stood there, a woman in her mid-40s, with the same quiet intensity that Henry had seen in David's photograph. Her eyes, sharp and guarded, studied them both before she stepped aside, silently inviting them in. The inside of the house was modest but cozy, filled with the smell of fresh coffee. Lena led them to the living room, where they sat across from her. For a long moment, no one spoke. "I'm not sure why you're here," Lena finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady but cautious. "But if it's about David, I don't know what you expect to find." Henry leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "It's not just about David. It's about my sister, Sarah Caldwell. She disappeared years ago, and David was the last person who had something of hers. I believe he was connected to her somehow, and I think you might know what happened." Lena's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She glanced down, her hands trembling slightly. "David, he wasn't who you think he was," she said softly. "He had secrets. But I didn't know the full extent of them until after he died." Henry's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Lena looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret. "He was involved in something, a group of people who took advantage of vulnerable women. They were discreet, careful, and no one ever suspected. I didn't realize the full extent until it was too late. I always thought he was just lost. But after his death, I found things, letters, documents. And one of those letters was about a girl. A girl named Sarah." Henry's breath caught in his throat. "What did it say?" Lena hesitated, then reached into a drawer beside her, pulling out a worn envelope. She handed it to Henry with shaking hands. "I don't know what part he played in her disappearance, but this letter, it's from her." Henry's hands shook as he opened the letter, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. Sarah's handwriting. It was a brief note, hurried, as if written in fear. "I don't have much time. If you find this, please know that I'm okay. I had to leave, there are people watching. I'm sorry, but I couldn't stay. Tell Henry the first love him." Tears welled in Henry's eyes as he read the words. Sarah had been alive, at least for a time. But where was she now? What had she been running from? He looked up at Lena, desperation in his voice. "Where is she? Where did she go?" Lena shook her head. "I don't know. That's the only letter I found. But if she was running, it means she's still out there, somewhere." Henry's heart pounded with both fear and hope. Sarah was alive. She had been hiding, running from something or someone. But now, for the first time in years, Henry had a glimmer of hope. He would find her. He had to. The search wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Henry stared at the letter, his hands trembling as the weight of its contents sank in. Sarah had been alive, at least when she wrote this. But the letter was years old. How long had she been running? And from whom? His mind swirled with questions, but at the heart of it all, one thing was certain: his sister had chosen to disappear to protect herself. That realization pierced his heart. What had been so dangerous that she couldn't come to him for help? Lena watched him carefully, her expression conflicted. "I found that letter after David's death. I didn't know what to do with it. I wasn't sure if I could trust the people who had been around him. I knew something wasn't right, but I was afraid that if I said anything, they'd come after me, too." Henry closed the letter, taking a deep breath to calm the emotions surging inside him. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "The people David was involved with, do you know who they are?" Lena's face darkened, her eyes flickering with something close to fear. "They're not people you want to cross, Mr. Caldwell. It was more than just a group. They were powerful, connected. They operated under the radar, using people like David to do their dirty work. Trafficking, extortion, things most people can't even imagine. If Sarah got caught up with them," she trailed off, her voice filled with dread. Henry felt a cold chill run down his spine. Trafficking? Extortion? Was Sarah caught in some kind of criminal ring? His stomach churned at the thought, and he fought to keep his composure. Do you have any idea where they might have taken her? Any place David might have mentioned? Lena shook her head slowly. David never talked about specifics. But I know they moved around a lot, different locations, different cities. The only thing I remember is that he once mentioned a place they used as a sort of safe house, a remote location where they kept people who were troublesome. It was somewhere up north, close to the Canadian border. Henry's mind raced. A safe house. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. He glanced at Paul, who had been quietly taking in the conversation. Paul nodded, understanding immediately what needed to be done. I'll start looking into any properties near the Canadian border, Paul said. If this group was using remote locations, we might be able to track them down through real estate or public records. Henry stood, a fire of determination burning in his chest. We have to find her, Paul. I don't care what it takes. Paul met his gaze, his face serious. We will. But you need to be prepared, Henry. Whatever we find, it might not be what you're hoping for. Henry swallowed hard, the weight of Paul's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He knew the risks, knew that finding Sarah after all these years could lead to painful truths. But the alternative, doing nothing, letting her stay lost, was unbearable. I have to know, Henry said, his voice firm. I have to try. Days turned into weeks as Paul dug into every lead he could find. Henry spent sleepless nights pacing the halls of his mansion, replaying memories of Sarah, trying to piece together the fragments of her disappearance. Every phone call from Paul sent a jolt of hope through him, only to be followed by frustration as each lead seemed to dissolve into dead ends. But then, one cold morning, Paul called with news. I found something, he said, his voice tense. A property in northern Vermont, near the border. It was purchased under a shell company, but the records trace back to someone who had ties to David. It matches the description Lena gave, a remote location, isolated from the nearest town. Henry's heart raced. This could be it. This could be the place where Sarah had been kept. I'm going there, he said immediately. I need to see it for myself. I'll come with you, Paul offered. We don't know what we'll find, and it might not be safe. Henry didn't argue. He knew that whatever lay ahead, he couldn't face it alone. The drive to Vermont felt surreal. The snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside Henry's mind. As they approached the property, a thick forest surrounded them, cutting them off from the outside world. The isolation was palpable, and Henry couldn't help but feel that they were stepping into a place where secrets had been buried for far too long. When they finally arrived at the property, the sight of the old, run-down house sent a shiver down Henry's spine. It was exactly as Lena had described, remote, dilapidated, with an air of abandonment. But something told him that it had once been very much alive with activity, the kind of activity no one spoke about. Paul parked the car, and they both stepped out into the freezing air. The silence was eerie, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their feet as they approached the house. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as they reached the door. Paul knocked, and for a long moment, there was no response. Just as Henry was about to suggest breaking in, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her face lined with age and hardship. Her eyes, however, were sharp, taking in Henry and Paul with quiet suspicion. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice rough and guarded. Henry stepped forward, trying to keep his voice steady. "My name is Henry Caldwell. I'm looking for my sister, Sarah. She disappeared years ago, and I believe she was here." The woman's expression flickered, just for a moment, before she masked it again. "You shouldn't be here," she said flatly. "This isn't a place for outsiders." Paul took a step closer. "We're not leaving until we get answers. We know what this place was used for. We know about David Arnett and the people he worked with. Now, tell us the truth, was Sarah Caldwell here?" The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Henry thought she would refuse to answer. But then she sighed, stepping back to let them inside. She was here, the woman admitted quietly. Years ago. But she's gone now. Henry's heart lurched. Gone? Where? Is she alive? The woman hesitated, glancing toward a dark hallway before speaking. She was alive when she left here. But I don't know where she went. She escaped. They were holding her here, but one night, she managed to get away. I haven't seen her since. Henry's knees nearly buckled. Sarah had been here, alive, trapped, and then she had escaped. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the fear. If she had escaped, where was she now? And who was still looking for her? Paul pressed on. Who was holding her? Who's behind all of this? The woman shook her head. I can't say. I don't know everything, just that the people involved are dangerous. Powerful. If they find out you're looking for her, they'll come for you too. Henry felt a cold wave of fear wash over him, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He had come too far. I don't care, he said, his voice firm. I'm going to find her. No matter what it takes. The woman gave him a long, hard look before speaking again. Then you'd better be prepared for what you'll find. Because she's not the same girl who disappeared all those years ago. Henry's heart sank at her words, but he refused to let fear stop him. He had a lead, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Sarah was out there, somewhere, and he was closer to finding her than ever before. The search was far from over. But Henry knew one thing for sure, he wouldn't stop until he brought his sister home. The weight of the woman's words settled over Henry like a dark cloud. She's not the same girl who disappeared all those years ago. Those words echoed in his mind as he and Paul left the dilapidated house. Snow crunched under their feet as they made their way back to the car, but the world around him felt muted, his focus narrowed to one thing, Sarah. Once inside the car, Paul turned to Henry, his voice low. We're close, Henry. She was here, and she escaped. That's more than we've had in years. Henry nodded, but his mind was still racing. What had Sarah gone through in this place? And if she had escaped, why hadn't she reached out to him? Was she still running, still hiding? And who were these people, the ones who had kept her here? The fear gnawed at him, but it was overtaken by a fierce determination. He had to keep going. What do we do now? Henry asked, his voice hoarse. Paul glanced back at the house before pulling out of the driveway. We need to retrace her steps. If she escaped, she would have needed help. Someone must have seen her, someone must know where she went. Back at the mansion, Henry couldn't rest. He pored over maps of the area, trying to make sense of Sarah's possible escape route. She must have been desperate, vulnerable, and alone. His mind kept returning to the letter Lena had found. Sarah had written that she was okay, but she had also mentioned being watched. Who had been watching her? The more he thought about it, the more questions piled up. 2 days passed, and Paul had been working around the clock, trying to find anyone in the northern towns who might remember seeing a woman fleeing from a remote property years ago. Finally, another lead came through. She was spotted, Paul said over the phone, his voice tinged with urgency. A man who works at a shelter in a small town north of here remembers a woman fitting Sarah's description. She showed up late one night, cold and scared. She stayed there for a few days before disappearing again. But here's the important part, she left a note. Henry's heart skipped a beat. What did it say? Paul sighed. It wasn't much. It said she was moving on, that she couldn't stay in one place too long. But the man at the shelter said something strange. He said that before she left, she asked him if he had heard of a place called Silver Pines. Silver Pines? Henry repeated. What is that? We're not sure yet, Paul admitted. It could be a place, a code, or something only she would understand. But it's the only clue we have. I'll start looking into it. Henry was restless as Paul dove into the search for Silver Pines. Days passed with no results, and the frustration of hitting wall after wall began to weigh on him. But he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. Every dead end felt like a blow, but the memory of Sarah's handwriting in that letter kept him going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Paul called with new information. "We found Silver Pines," he said, the relief evident in his voice. "It's a small, secluded town up in the mountains. Barely on the map. It used to be a retreat for wealthy families decades ago, but now, it's practically deserted." Henry felt a spark of hope ignite. "Do you think she went there?" "I don't know," Paul replied cautiously. "But it fits the pattern. If Sarah was looking for a place to disappear, Silver Pines would be perfect. It's isolated, hidden from the world. No one would find her there unless they knew where to look." Henry's pulse quickened. He was so close, he could feel it. "We need to go there." Paul agreed, and the next morning, they were on the road again, heading toward the mountains. As they drove, Henry's mind raced with possibilities. What would he find at Silver Pines? Would Sarah be there, or was this just another dead end? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but the thought of being close to her after all these years was the only thing that kept him moving forward. Silver Pines was even more isolated than Henry had imagined. The small town was nestled deep in the mountains, surrounded by thick forests that seemed to swallow everything around them. As they drove through the narrow, winding roads, Henry felt a strange sense of both dread and anticipation. This place, with its decaying buildings and empty streets, felt like a place where secrets could easily be buried. When they arrived at the town center, a few old buildings that looked like they hadn't been touched in years, Henry felt the gravity of how far Sarah had gone to disappear. If she had come here, she truly didn't want to be found. They began asking around, hoping someone had seen a woman matching Sarah's description. At first, no one seemed to remember. The locals were suspicious of outsiders, and most of them seemed to prefer keeping to themselves. But after hours of questioning, they found a breakthrough. An elderly woman who ran a small general store recalled a young woman who had passed through several years ago. She stayed in the old cabins by the lake for a while, the woman said, her voice low and raspy. But she didn't talk to anyone. Kept to herself. Then one day, she was just gone. Henry's heart pounded in his chest. "Do you remember her name?" The woman shook her head. "No name. But she looked sad. Like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders." Henry exchanged a glance with Paul. This had to be Sarah. The trail was getting warmer. "Where are these cabins?" Paul asked, his voice steady. The woman pointed toward the edge of town. "Down by the lake, but no one goes there anymore. It's abandoned." Without wasting another moment, Henry and Paul drove to the lake. The air was colder here, the wind whipping through the trees as they approached the old, weathered cabins. They were tucked away in the woods, their roofs sagging under years of neglect, but something about the place felt hauntingly familiar. Henry couldn't explain it, but he knew Sarah had been here. The first few cabins were empty, decayed by time. But as they reached the last one, Henry stopped in his tracks. The door was slightly ajar. His heart raced as he pushed it open, stepping inside. The cabin was small and sparse, but something on the table caught his eye. A notebook. He picked it up, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. It was Sarah's handwriting. The entries were short, fragmented thoughts, anxious scribbles about staying hidden, about feeling watched. But then, on the last page, a message. "If you're reading this, it means you found me. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. I had to keep moving. But don't give up on me. I'll come back when it's safe." Henry's breath caught in his throat. She had been here. She had left this for him, or for anyone who cared enough to find her. Tears blurred his vision as he clutched the notebook. Sarah was still out there. And she was waiting to come home. The notebook in Henry's hands felt heavier than it should have, its pages brimming with the weight of his sister's words, her voice, fragile yet defiant, echoing across time and distance. Sarah had been here, in this abandoned cabin by the lake, hiding from something, or someone, she believed was still chasing her. The fear she had carried for years was palpable in her writings, and it made Henry's heart ache. She had been so close, yet always just out of reach. Paul stood nearby, his eyes scanning the cabin, ever the investigator. "This is a good sign, Henry. She was here, and it looks like she left this for someone to find, maybe even for you. We're on the right track." Henry nodded, but the reality of the situation weighed heavily on him. Sarah had been running for years. The message in the notebook hinted that she still wasn't safe, that even now, she was hiding. But from what? Or from whom? "We need to figure out where she went after this," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "If she left this message here, it means she had a plan, she wasn't just aimlessly running." Paul agreed. "I'll see if anyone else in town remembers seeing her after she left the cabins. Maybe she made contact with someone, or left another trail." As Paul left the cabin to continue his investigation, Henry remained behind, pacing the small space. His eyes wandered over the few items left behind, an old chair, a blanket, and a few scattered notes that hinted at Sarah's state of mind during her time here. She had been scared, but there was also a quiet determination in her words. He flipped through the notebook again, his eyes lingering on the last page. "Don't give up on me." Henry's heart clenched. He hadn't given up. He would never give up on her, no matter how long it took. He stepped outside into the cold mountain air, his breath visible in the chilly breeze. The lake in front of the cabins was calm, its stillness a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The isolation of this place made it clear why Sarah had chosen it. No one would have thought to look for her here. But now that he was closer than ever, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Paul returned later that afternoon with more information. "I talked to a few locals who remember a woman matching Sarah's description. She didn't stay long after leaving the cabins, just a couple of weeks. One of the locals said she left in a hurry, like she was afraid of being found." "Did anyone know where she went?" Henry asked, the desperation in his voice impossible to hide. Paul nodded. "One person said she was asking about the next town over, Cedar Ridge. It's even more remote than Silver Pines. They think she might have gone there, but no one's certain." Cedar Ridge. Another small, hidden town. It made sense. Sarah was moving from one secluded place to another, always staying ahead of whoever was pursuing her. Henry felt a mixture of relief and frustration. They were one step closer, but there was no guarantee Sarah was still in Cedar Ridge. She could have moved on again. "We need to go there," Henry said, determination hardening his voice. "If there's even a chance she's in Cedar Ridge, I have to find her." The drive to Cedar Ridge was quiet, the landscape growing more desolate as they ascended further into the mountains. Snow began to fall softly, blanketing the roads and trees in a white silence. Henry's mind was racing, replaying Sarah's words over and over. She was close, he could feel it. But with every mile, the fear that she had slipped away again gnawed at him. When they arrived in Cedar Ridge, it was clear that the town was even smaller than Silver Pines. There were only a few scattered buildings, most of them worn down by time and the harsh elements. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, where strangers weren't welcomed with open arms. They began asking questions, but it was clear that the locals were wary. No one wanted to talk about strangers passing through, and those who did remember someone fitting Sarah's description seemed reluctant to share more than vague details. It was as if the whole town was shrouded in a veil of secrecy. Then, just as the trail seemed to be growing cold again, a young woman who worked at the only diner in town pulled Paul aside. "I remember her," the woman whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "She was here a while ago. Didn't stay long. She came in every day for about a week, always kept to herself. But there was something about her, like she was scared." Henry's heart pounded. "Did she say anything? Where she was going?" The woman hesitated, biting her lip before answering. "She asked me about a place called Raven's Hollow. I don't know much about it. It's an old, abandoned community further up the mountain. Hardly anyone goes there anymore, but some folks say it's haunted. I thought it was strange she was asking about it, but she seemed desperate. Paul frowned. Raven's Hollow? Why would she go there? I don't know, the woman said, shaking her head. But if she was looking for somewhere to hide, that would be the place. No one goes there. It's too remote, too dangerous. Henry exchanged a look with Paul. This was the most concrete lead they had. If Sarah had asked about Raven's Hollow, it meant she was heading there, or had already gone. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. We're going there, Henry said, his voice filled with grim determination. The road to Raven's Hollow was treacherous, barely passable in some places due to the snow and ice. The higher they climbed, the more desolate the landscape became. Henry's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his pulse quickening as they neared their destination. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into something dangerous, something unknown, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was finding Sarah. After what felt like hours, they reached the outskirts of Raven's Hollow. The abandoned community was hidden deep within the mountains, its crumbling buildings almost swallowed by the forest. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of Henry's neck stand up. Are you sure about this? Paul asked, his voice tense as they stepped out of the car. Henry nodded. I have to be. They began searching the area, moving cautiously through the ruins of what had once been a small, thriving village. The place had a ghostly quality, with its empty houses and overgrown paths, as if it had been frozen in time. After hours of searching, they found nothing, no sign of Sarah, no clues to where she might have gone. Despair began to creep in, but Henry refused to give up. Not now. Not when they were this close. Then, just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, Henry spotted something. A light, flickering from one of the old houses deeper in the woods. His heart leapt in his chest. There, he whispered, pointing. Someone's there. Paul followed his gaze, his expression hardening. Let's go. They moved quickly but quietly, approaching the house with caution. As they neared the door, Henry's breath caught. Could this finally be it? Could Sarah be inside? He knocked, his hand trembling slightly. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with shock. Henry's breath caught in his throat. It was Sarah. Henry, she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Tears welled up in Henry's eyes as he stepped forward, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and overwhelming emotion. Sarah, he choked, reaching out to her. I found you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she took a step back, shaking her head. You shouldn't have come. Henry's heart sank. Why? What's wrong? What happened to you? Sarah looked over her shoulder, her face contorted with fear. They're still watching me, Henry. They'll come for you, too. Before he could respond, a noise from inside the house made Henry's blood run cold. He realized they weren't alone. And in that moment, he knew, this wasn't over. Not yet. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as the realization sank in. The tension in the air was thick, and Sarah's terrified expression sent a chill down his spine. Whoever had been watching her, whoever had kept her running all these years, was still close. Too close. He glanced at Paul, who had also picked up on the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Paul's hand instinctively moved to his side, where Henry knew he carried a concealed weapon, just in case. But the fear in Sarah's eyes told Henry that this situation wasn't something that could be resolved with force alone. Sarah, Henry whispered, stepping forward, his voice soft but urgent. We need to leave. Now. We can protect you, but we have to go. Sarah shook her head, backing further into the house. Her hands trembled as she clutched the doorframe, her body rigid with fear. You don't understand, Henry, she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's not just about me. They'll come for you if you stay. You're already in danger just by being here." Paul's eyes scanned the surrounding area, his instincts on high alert. "We need to move, Henry. This place is compromised." But Henry couldn't take his eyes off his sister. She looked so fragile, so broken, but beneath that fear, there was still a spark of the Sarah he remembered. He wasn't going to let her slip away again. He had fought too hard, searched for too long. "I'm not leaving you," Henry said, his voice stronger now. "Not again. Whatever's going on, we'll face it together. I'm not losing you a second time." Tears filled Sarah's eyes, and she looked at him with a mixture of love and anguish. "You shouldn't have come," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "They don't care about me anymore, Henry. It's you they want." Henry's blood ran cold. "Me?" Before he could respond, a sudden noise from the back of the house broke the moment, footsteps, hurried and deliberate. Paul's eyes narrowed, and he stepped in front of Henry instinctively. "We need to go, now," Paul said firmly, his voice low but commanding. But Henry couldn't move. His mind was reeling from what Sarah had just said. Who were they, and why would they care about him? He hadn't been involved in whatever had happened to Sarah, he had been searching for her, desperate to find her. How could he be the target? The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they weren't alone. Suddenly, the back door slammed open, and two figures emerged from the shadows. Dressed in dark, unmarked clothing, their faces obscured, they moved with precision, like professionals. Paul immediately raised his gun, but Henry knew this wasn't a fight they could win. "Get behind me," Paul ordered, his voice calm but firm. One of the figures stepped forward, speaking in a low, menacing tone. "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Caldwell. Leave now, and you won't be harmed. This is between us and her." Henry's chest tightened with rage. "No," he spat, stepping closer to Sarah. "I'm not leaving. You took her life from her, you won't take her from me again." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill down Henry's spine. "You're a fool. This was never about her. She was a pawn. You, Henry Caldwell, have something we need. You just don't know it yet." Henry's heart raced, his mind spinning. What could they possibly mean? He had no idea who these people were, what they wanted, or how he could be involved. But one thing was clear, they weren't going to let Sarah go easily. Paul, his eyes focused and calm, stepped forward, his gun raised. "You've got 3 seconds to back off," he warned, his voice steely. "Or this ends badly for you." The second figure, who had been silent until now, took a step forward, speaking in a low, almost mocking voice. "You think you can protect him? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Paul's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could act, the first figure moved with lightning speed, pulling a weapon of his own. Henry barely had time to react before the gunshot rang out. The sound echoed through the small cabin, deafening and final. Paul crumpled to the ground, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Blood pooled beneath him, his gun slipping from his hand. Henry's heart stopped as he stared in horror at his friend, the realization that Paul was gone hitting him like a physical blow. "No!" Henry shouted, rushing to Paul's side, but it was too late. The life had already left his body. Sarah screamed, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. "Henry, please," she cried, her voice breaking with terror. "You have to go. You can't stay here." The two figures stepped forward, their weapons still drawn. "You should have listened," the first man said coldly. "But now, it's too late. You've made your choice." Henry's mind raced. Paul was dead, and Sarah was still in danger. His only option was to run, to get Sarah out of there before they both met the same fate. But the two men blocked the only exit, their expressions calm and cruel. Desperation surged through Henry, and without thinking, he grabbed Paul's gun from the floor. His hand shook as he aimed it at the two men, his mind screaming that he wasn't a killer, that he didn't know how to do this, but he had no choice. "I won't let you take her," Henry growled, his voice raw with emotion. The first man smirked, taking a step closer. "You don't even know what's at stake, do you? Your family has been involved in this for generations. Your father kept secrets from you, Henry. Secrets that have now come back to haunt you." Henry's grip on the gun tightened. "I don't care about the past. All I care about is my sister." "You should care," the man replied, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "Because the answers you're looking for are the same ones that will destroy you." In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. Henry's mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the cryptic words, the hidden threats. But there was no time to unravel the mystery now. All he knew was that he had to get Sarah out of here alive. Before he could react, the second man lunged forward, knocking the gun from Henry's hands. The weapon clattered to the floor, and Henry felt a sharp blow to his side as the man's fist connected with his ribs. Pain shot through him, but he fought back, struggling to keep his balance. Sarah screamed again, backing into the corner of the room, her eyes wide with terror. Henry stumbled, his vision blurring from the pain, but he refused to give up. With every ounce of strength he had left, he threw himself at the second man, knocking him to the ground. The two of them wrestled on the floor, the fight desperate and brutal. But the first man was still standing, his gun aimed directly at Henry. Henry's world froze as he stared down the barrel of the gun, the cold realization that he was about to die washing over him. But then, a voice rang out, Sarah's voice. "Stop," she cried, her voice filled with a raw, desperate power. "If you kill him, you'll never get what you want." The first man hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. "What are you talking about?" Sarah stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears but also with a fierce, protective determination. "I know what you want. I know what you've been looking for. But if you kill him, you'll lose everything." Henry's breath caught in his throat as he stared at his sister. What did she mean? What did she know that he didn't? The man lowered his gun slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You have 1 minute to explain." Sarah looked at Henry, her eyes filled with sorrow and love. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Then she turned back to the man, her voice steady. "I'll give you what you want, but only if you let him go." Henry's heart pounded. What had Sarah just agreed to? What was she willing to sacrifice to save him? Before he could stop her, the first man smiled darkly and nodded. "Deal." Henry, still injured, could barely process what was happening. Sarah stood between him and the armed men, offering something they clearly wanted, but what? His heart raced, and the pain in his ribs made it hard to focus. One thing was certain, Sarah was willing to sacrifice something huge to save him. "Sarah, no!" Henry tried to shout, but his voice was weak. Sarah looked at him, tears in her eyes, but her face was resolute. "I have no choice, Henry. This was always about our family's legacy, about what our father hid. He was involved with these people long before we knew, and they think you have the answers. But it's not true. I'm the one who knows." The man with the gun tilted his head, intrigued. "Where is it, Sarah? What we've been looking for?" Sarah took a deep breath. "In a safe, left by our father. I have the key. If you let Henry go, I'll give you what you want." The man smirked. "If that's true, then he lives. But if you're lying—" "I'm not," she interrupted, her voice steady. The deal was made. Sarah handed over the key, and the man lowered his gun, signaling for them to leave. Henry, still in shock, felt Sarah pull him to his feet, leading him away. Hours later, they were far from the danger. Henry, sitting next to Sarah in a small cabin they had found to hide in, finally broke the silence. "Why did you do that? What was in the safe?" Sarah sighed. "Incriminating documents, secrets about our family that those men wanted buried. Our father was involved with them for years, and they betrayed him. I found those papers and used them to keep myself safe. But now, it's over. They have what they wanted. Henry shook his head, still in disbelief. And you? Are you safe now? Sarah looked at him with a small, sad smile. I am, because you came for me. They sat in silence, the shadows of the past still hanging over them, but for the first time in years, Henry knew they had a chance to start over, together, finally free from what had kept them apart. The nightmare was over. And, difficult as it had been, Sarah was finally home. The quiet of the cabin wrapped around them, the cold mountain air outside a stark contrast to the warmth and peace Henry felt sitting beside Sarah. For so long, he had imagined this moment, finding her, bringing her home, but it hadn't unfolded the way he expected. There was no triumphant return, no perfect resolution. Just the reality of two people, battered by the weight of their shared past, finally able to breathe. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant. I spent so many nights wondering if you were looking for me, she said softly. I thought maybe I was already gone in your mind, like a ghost. Henry's chest tightened. I never stopped, Sarah. Not for a second. I hired investigators, I chased every lead, but nothing made sense. Then that necklace, his voice trailed off as he remembered the moment he had seen her wearing it. That was the first real hope I'd had in years. She smiled faintly, touching the spot where the necklace had once hung. It was my way of leaving a trail, in case you ever got close enough to find me. I never wanted to disappear, Henry. I was forced to. The things I learned about our father. I had no choice. Henry clenched his fists, trying to push back the anger that surged through him whenever their father's name was mentioned. He should have protected you, he said, his voice tight. Instead, he pulled you into his mess and left you to deal with it. Sarah nodded, her face shadowed with grief. He made mistakes, terrible ones. But in the end, he tried to make things right. Those documents I gave them, they're the last piece of his redemption. It wasn't enough to save him, but maybe it's enough to save us. Henry looked at her, the weight of her words settling deep in his heart. What happens now? He asked quietly. Sarah sighed, glancing toward the window, where the snow was starting to fall again. I don't know. The men who were after me have what they wanted, but I'll never be able to erase what I know or what I've been through. But at least now, I'm not running anymore. Henry reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. You don't have to be alone anymore, Sarah. We'll figure this out together. I've spent too many years without you, and I'm not losing you again. She met his eyes, a flicker of hope in her expression. I missed you so much, Henry. I wanted to come back, but I didn't want to bring danger to your door. You're my sister, he said, his voice filled with emotion. Nothing could have kept me from finding you. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them but no longer crushing. They had survived the worst of it, the lies, the fear, the years apart. Now, they just had to rebuild. Sarah stood up, walking to the window and gazing out into the snowy wilderness. It's strange, she said, her voice soft, almost distant. For so long, I thought I'd never feel safe again. But with you here, maybe I finally can. Henry joined her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. We'll take it one day at a time, Sarah. We'll figure out what comes next. She nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder, the tension in her body slowly easing. I don't know where we go from here, she admitted. But as long as we're together, I think we'll be okay. For the first time in years, Henry believed that. Despite everything they had been through, despite the scars they carried, they had found their way back to each other. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. As the snow fell quietly outside, they stood side by side, the weight of the past beginning to lift. Their future was uncertain, but in this moment, they were finally home. And that, Henry knew, was enough. If you were moved by this story and want to see more like it, please consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback helps shape the next story and keeps the conversation going. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional stories that dive deep into the heart of human connections. Join us on this journey, your support means the world.